The valley kept its name like a wound remembers a scar. Ilmer lay cupped between two ridges of slate-gray rock, a narrow throat of water threading through its middle like a vein. In spring it might once have been kind, fields of wheat, children's laughter, the bell of the chapel tolling for weddings and harvests. Now the bell swung on a rope eaten with rot. Its peals answered nothing. Houses hunched under sagging roofs, windows like closed eyes. Fog crawled in each evening, not with the fresh breath of rain but with the smell of ash and old sorrow, and even the river sounded tired, dragging itself past mossy stones with a thin, exhausted voice. At the valley's edge, where the lane gave up its last polite cobbles and the forest began to crowd its skirts, stood a cottage that would have been picturesque in better weather. Vines had claimed the stone. A lean porch sagged under the weight of winter. Inside, a single candle dimpled the darkness, and a woman sat by the window, her back the silhouette of a small, untranslatable grief. Mara Everell had been born in Ilmer and measured by its failures. At 20, she carried an age older than her face. The world had taught her two things: the cruelty of other people and the precise geography of pain. The fall that took her legs was a winter thing, a wheel, ice, a brittle promise breaking. After that night, the villagers learned how to look away. Where they once had offered bread and rumor, they now offered only the pity that runs colder than contempt. Her father left before the snow thawed. Her mother spoke of duty and then of shame. Those who had once stood at her cradle now stood in their doorways whispering that the Everells were cursed. Mara knew how to list losses like inventory. The weight of a sister's hand, the shape of a friend's laugh, the careful way a suitor folded his gaze away. Most of all, she knew the small, precise loneliness of living within four walls with a single window. From that window, she watched the valley die and be reborn in lesser ways. A roof collapsing, a carted-away child, the slow rot of holidays. She memorized the weather so that at least something in her life would keep its promises. The candle beside her guttered and was trimmed, and still she sat, listening to the valley breathe. There were nights when anger came with the fog. Mara would press her palms to the cool glass and think of how easy it would be to push until it broke, and the world outside rushed in and tore her to pieces. But anger needed motion she no longer had. So she held it in her ribs and wore it like armor, sharp and useless. Her bitterness tasted of iron and rain. Not all the valley's stories were small and petty. Some were old enough to be dangerous. Mothers still told their children to be inside before the woods woke. Fishermen wouldn't cast nets near the far bank after dusk. They spoke of the old clan that had once walked Ilmer like winter, tall men and longer nights who were not quite men at all. The tales were half remembered, a bite exchanged for a promise, a house standing empty at dawn, a shadow crossing a moon. Folk softened their voices when they said the name some called in anger and others in dread. The Alphas. They were a thing of authority and appetite, of courtly cruelty and an order older than the chapel stones. Mara had listened to these tales as all the valley did, with the particular attentiveness of the isolated. Stories were maps to places you could never reach, and maps were how you measured the world's possibilities. She believed the stories the way one believes in weather, because they explained things that had no other explanation. But study and belief are not the same as reckoning. Reckoning arrives with cold hands. That winter, the woods seemed to sharpen their edges. The wind had a new weight, as if it carried footsteps that did not belong to fox or stag. The trees, black and bare, whispered like old paper. Once, twice on the same frozen week, Mara heard at dusk a sound she had not catalogued before. A low, long note, not quite a howl, not quite a song, threaded at the edges with something like hunger and something else that made her forget to breathe. It made the candle tremble on its plate and left a hollow at the center of the cottage where something had been and then was not. Neighbors said the valley had troubles of its own, but they also said, mind your threshold, for thresholds are the small theorems upon which larger fates hinge. The lane outside Mara's door grew slippery with wet leaves. Footprints came and left, sometimes overlapping with the tracks of animals, sometimes not. Once a boot heel printed the mud and then faded into nothing, too large for any living foot and too precise for wind. At first she told herself it was the river, or the farmer come back at night. Then she would trace old maps in her mind, the ones in the tailies. A crowned figure crossing a field, an invitation left unasked for. Mara's nights grew populated with small apprehensions. She found herself turning at the sound of a twig, listening for breath that wasn't hers. Strange things settled into the house like dust. A slow draft, a shadow that lingered upon the stair, the sweet metallic scent that made her throat clench as if she had swallowed a coin. Curiosity, which had always been a dangerous friend, began to untangle from fear. For the first time since the fall, Mara felt a tug toward the world that was not purely dread. On the evening the valley seemed to hold its breath, she rose and moved to the door, not because she could walk, but because there are acts one performs to prove to oneself that one still exists. The lamp was a weak lighthouse against a wide sea of dark. She pressed her forehead to the wood and listened. Beyond the lane, in the choked black of the trees, something stopped moving. The air felt like a held hand. She smelled earth, rain, and a cold iron undercurrent that wasn't her candle or the rusting hinges. A moment later, the sound reached her, a heavy step that did not scuff the earth but parted it, a presence like a shadow folding into daylight. It was a sound that promised endings and beginnings at once. And Mara, who had rehearsed death 1,000 times in the quiet, felt something else rise, an answering shape in the chest that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with recognition. Outside, the valley held its breath. Inside, Mara remembered a line from an old folktale. When the long night takes a hand, kindness may be found in the smallest fist. She did not yet know whether the hand approaching would crush or lift. She only knew the world had arrived at her threshold, and with it, the first step of a fate she had not chosen. They came at dawn, when the fog sat low and the lane looked like a ribbon of bone. Mara had heard their boots the night before, voices muffled beneath blankets, the clink of jugs being taken down from the larder, but she told herself they would not leave her. People left the valley all the time. Sometimes they came back with new shoes, sometimes they did not. She rehearsed their return like liturgy, the creak of the gate, the smell of bread, the thump of a hand against the doorframe. She waited for the ordinary mercy of familiar footsteps. Mercy did not arrive. Instead, the door opened on words that were small and sharp as knives. "Good riddance," her stepmother said without looking at her. The bowl in the woman's hands trembled like a bird trapped in cloth. "We've given him more than his dues. We keep what we can. We cannot carry shame in winter." Her stepbrother laughed, a short, ugly sound that had the taste of old coin. "She's a burden, Mother. You know what folks say, the Everells will bring the rot if they stay. Leave her by the wood. Let the forest take what the valley rejects." They said it as if it were a season. Mara listened and catalogued each word the way she had once catalogued the weather. The tone like frost, the finality like a slammed window. The cottage blurred. She felt something in her chest that could have been anger, but was more often the precise geometry of helplessness. She had learned the choreography of abandonment, the polite turning away of neighbors, the careful omission from wills, the silence of footsteps that used to come for supper. "You can't leave me there," she said. Her voice had the brittle quality of dried leaves. It surprised her to hear it. She had practiced begging behind her quilt when no one watched, practiced smallness until it fit. Saying the words aloud made them too big for the room. "We do what's right," her stepmother replied. "If you'd been born better, maybe—" The sentence dissolved into that practiced pity that collars itself with duty. Mara knew the rest. The stepmother's eyes, the turn of the hand, the ritual of leaving. They wrapped her in ragged wool and set her on a board meant for bringing a market pig to market. It painted the lie of dignity over disgrace. They carried her like a thing to be disposed of and walked her down to where the lane met the woods, where shadows gathered like gossip. The air there tasted of iron and wet leaves. The trees leaned in as if to watch. Mara's head was full of small resistances. The smell of her own blood from the scar on her thigh, the ache in her shoulders from being born, the cruel, absurd thought that maybe if she lifted her chin, she could meet her fate with a measure of grace. She wanted to say something that would stay in their throats, words like "I am not nothing," or "You are ashamed of yourselves." But her voice, that miserable instrument, only made a thin sound. "Here," her stepbrother said, and let her board slide into the churned mud. The board would be left propped against a tree, a message. Stay here, be still, be small. The stepmother folded her hands as if in prayer and left without a backward glance. Mara watched their boots vanish, each step like a punctuation mark. When the cart eased away, the lane settled into a silence like a held breath. The world, for a moment, forgot to move. Mara was alone on the rim of the forest. The trees were solemn witnesses, their trunks black columns. She should have felt abandonment as a final thing, heavy and unyielding. Instead, there was a dull, searing white inside her, not the acute flare of surprise, but an exhausted resignation that had been gathering like mold in the corners of the heart. She tried to slide herself from the board and failed. Her hands, calloused from refusing to be useless, scraped the mud. The cold kissed the skin that had once been sheltered by skirts and shawls. She had crawled before, once into a cellar to rescue an animal, once across a thrashing floor after the fall. Crawling was a language she had learned in private. It required patience and a bitter acceptance of the body's traitorous limits. She began the slow, animal motion of moving forward one hand, then the other, dragging a useless lower body behind like a pair of broken oars. The ground was unkind. Gravel bit the palms, wet leaves stuck to the sleeves. The nearer she drew to the trees, the more the air seemed to thicken, not with sentiment but with attention. Something in the forest held its breath as she passed. Wolves, the valley said, watched those edges. They smelled blood and poverty, and sometimes the promise of an easy meal. Mara could imagine their yellow eyes like coins in the brush. They were there before she saw them. A low rustle, a soft pad that made the hair lift along her arms. Wolves circled, not yet bold enough to take, but close enough that she could hear the rasp of their breathing. Their muzzles were stained with dusk. Their silhouettes were a kind of punctuation against the trees. They moved with an elegant cruelty, as if they were reading a story in which she had been given the role of prey and were determined to perform it. Fear came then, bright, sharp, and raw. Fear made the world narrow into a tunnel of sound. Her breath, the shot of her pulse, the whisper of her fingers in the dirt. She felt the old, animal part of herself shrink and curl away into the small hollow where she kept her first truths. That she wanted to be seen, that she wanted a voice, that she wanted, when the day was stripped bare, to be dignified. A low sound threaded through the air, something like a hum that did not belong to the wolves. It was not sound so much as a movement in the dark, a shifting of distance. The wolves lifted their heads, ears twitching, and for the first time their bodies stiffened. The alpha, the leader, the one who reads the weather, had cocked its head and sniffed at the space where a new scent had arrived. Then he was there. He stepped from the forest like a panel of night had peeled back. He was not merely a man. He was a silhouette given edge. He wore darkness as if it were a cloak, not resting on him but grown from him. The air around him seemed colder where his skin would have been if one had been kind enough to name it. His boots did not disturb the mud. The wolves backed away, less out of fear than because some older law had been spoken, and they meant to obey it. Kaelith looked like the valley's old stories made flesh. Tall, impossibly poised, a face cut with lines that were not quite human and eyes that took memory and held it like a coin. They were not bright. They did not sparkle with mortal mirth. They were instead patient and hungry, the way the moon looks at a field it has mapped for centuries. There was a scent about him, cold iron and thunder, the smell of rain before it falls that made Mara's stomach twist and kept her small, but not because of terror alone. There was also a steadiness to him, something that felt like rock in a river bed. He knelt without speaking, the movement slow and intentional. Up close she could see that his hands were not cruel. Long, sure, capable of brutality and gentleness in one sweep. He reached for her not like one hunting for food, but like one reclaiming something lost. His fingers slipped beneath the ragged blanket and under the skein of wool. Mara wanted to flinch. Instead, she watched as his thumb brushed the scar at her hip and then withdrew, as if he read an inscription there and took a breath to steady himself. "You should not be left," he said at last. His voice was not loud. It was the sound of an old bell sounding in the hollow of the ribs. It carried authority and a curious softness that did not fit with the night. The wolves lay down at his feet, folding themselves into the earth the way servants fold cloth. He lifted her with the economy of a man who had carried kingdoms and burdens, without being undone. When his arms closed around her, the world altered, not in miraculous light, but in the simple physics of safety. She expected to be treated like prey, to feel the bite of teeth or the cold of a lantern blown out. Instead, she felt a claim so absolute it was almost gentle. He held her to him in a cradle that did not ask her to become smaller to fit. Mara, who had rehearsed death and humiliation in equal measure, felt something she had not practiced: the fierce, discomfiting bloom of being chosen. She tasted the tang of iron on the air, and for the first time the scent did not make her throat close. The wolves watched, their eyes reflecting the strange new geometry of the moment. Mara's fingers curled into the fold of his coat, into fabric that seemed older than the valley and warmer than any hearth she had known in years. Her breath evened. For a sliver of time, the sort that human calendars do not measure, she believed she had been plucked from a story of abandonment and placed into one that might have another ending. The castle did not announce itself so much as rearrange the night around it. Where the lane shuddered into the forest, stone rose like a stern remedy. Buttresses carved with curling sigils, windows that glowed with the late light of torches, and an iron gate that sighed open as if it had been waiting for a particular foot to press the ground. Kaelith moved through that threshold with the quiet certainty of one born to halls that never fully belonged to any single age. Mara, bundled against the cold and the shock of being lifted, felt the world reframed by the geometry of shadow and flame. Inside, the fortress breathed in rhythms that belonged to other calendars. Corridors arched into one another like the ribs of some great sleeping beast. Tapestries hung heavy and secretive, their patterns a language Mara did not know but understood by intuition. Lines that insisted on being read slowly. Candles pooled light into laps of gold that the stone drank greedily. The air smelled of old wood, iron, and something floral that tugged at memory. Perhaps the scent of a summer she had never lived, or of a garden that belonged to a different century. Sound moved differently here. Footsteps were deliberate. Voices did not echo but bowed. They passed through a great hall where a hearth held a fire with a color like burnt amber. Shadows gathered in the corners as if they, too, wanted to be warm. Statues stood at intervals, not entirely lifeless. If one paid close attention, their faces shifted like clouds. Portraits watched from high frames, the eyes of painted ancestors tracking the small figure held at Kaelith's chest. In one corner, a small collection of dried herbs lay in a bowl, their edges like the teeth of small moons. Mara clung to Kaelith's coat, to the solidity of him, and the coat answered back with a texture that felt like history rather than cloth. Her legs, useless and heavy as the memory of snow, dangled. She expected Pity to enter the room with them and slide into the furniture, but Pity did not come. Instead, a hush that was not cold but deliberate settled over the servants and shadows. They regarded her with an attention that did not divide her into useful pieces. A young woman, a keeper of fires, Mara guessed, stepped forward and offered a blanket with hands that trembled at first, then steadied as if being near Mara was a lesson in conducting courage. Kaelith carried her to a chamber that smelled faintly of lavender and iron. It was vast and intimate at once. A bed heavy with quilts, a window that framed the forest like a painting, and a small table where a single bowl of broth steamed. The walls were lined with books whose spines were creased with unread time. Moonlight fell in a shy strip across the floor, and Mara watched it as if it were an invitation. "You will eat," Kaelith said without ceremony. There was a sentence in his voice that bore no assumption, only fact. He set her gently on the edge of the bed and placed the bowl in her lap. The broth was savory and rich in a way that made Mara's teeth ache with gratitude. It tasted of root and patience. She sipped like someone coming back to speech after a long silence. There was, beneath the fortress's stillness, a pulse, not of clocks, but of a presence. Kaelith moved around the room with the assurance of one who knew the exact map of every shadow therein. For all the grandeur, his gestures were small and precise, drawing the curtains a fraction, testing the hearth, setting a cup within reach. Every action was an argument that the castle could be a home, not merely a throne. Mara watched him, curiosity nodding with an unfamiliar warmth. He did not look at her legs in the way the valley had. His eyes, when they lingered on her, found the lines about her mouth, the way her knuckles were calloused, the stubborn set of her shoulders. He searched for a name to call beyond the one that echoed with pity in the lane, and when he spoke it, it had the steady weight of recognition. "You are Mara Everell," he said. The syllables fell like a name carved into bone. "You should not be left." Hearing her full name from him, not as a ledger entry or a rumor, but as if he had held it like a promise, unmoored her. She braced to hear the old terms the world had used on her: burden, shame, cripple. None came. His refusal to reduce her did not insist she pretend to be unhurt. It simply refused the valley's contract of diminishment. For Kaelith, the sight of her arced through something older than benevolence, a recognition that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with an instinctive tally. He, who had watched centuries go by like pages thumbed in boredom, found in Mara a narrative that unstitched the neat armor he wore. He saw in her not the absence of legs, but the abundance of small, stubborn gestures that marked a life still very much lived. There was bravery in the way she ate, in the quiet attention she paid to the room, in the way her gaze did not flinch when the portraits watched. For a creature used to being read as desire and appetite, encountering one who afforded him no such map felt, bizarrely, like being read. As the night smoothed its hands into the fortress, Kaelith made a quiet offering. He walked to a small chest and opened it with a gesture that suggested ritual. Inside lay a length of wool, dyed the color of stormwater, and woven with a pattern that echoed the curling sigils on the castle's buttresses. He folded it and wrapped it around Mara's shoulders, the fabric warm and faintly scented with lavender. "You will have a place here," he said, "until you choose otherwise. No one may harm you under my roof." The words were an oath shaped out of old authority, and they landed in Mara like a bell. They were simple, but the simplicity itself carried weight. No promise had ever been offered with such bluntness in the valley. Promises there were always clauses hidden like thorns. Here the clause was absence. He did not speak of conversion or repayment. He did not crease the sentence with conditions. It was an uncompromised protection, either naive or absolute. Mara felt a tremor of emotion she did not name. Relief, yes, a fragile, surprised gratitude, but also a discomfort, as if a hand had said aloud something she had whispered to herself for years and forced her to accept it. She was used to being the small thing people carried away when inconvenient. Now she had been carried into a place that called her by name and set her beside fire and food, as if she were the natural order of the world. "Why?" she asked at last, the words small and honest. It was the question that had kept her awake through many nights. Why would a thing like him stoop? Why would a lord of shadows shelter a broken girl? Kaelith paused. For an instant, the fortress's ancient faces seemed to press closer to listen. He looked down at her with an expression that could have been grief or memory or hunger softened by thought. "Because no one should be left to rot," he said simply. "Because I remember what it is to be abandoned." In the space that opened between them, Mara heard something like other reasons, ones that would be revealed slowly, in the geometry of days and dangers. For now the castle held them both. A woman who had been taught to expect rejection, and a creature who had learned to count the cost of attachments. Each found in the other an anatomy of loneliness that might, if tended, become a shelter. The fortress hummed around them, alive with 1,000 small histories, and somewhere beyond the high windows the forest exhaled, taking a step back to let this strange arrangement breathe. Mara learned the small, private geography of loss in slow measures. The way a doorframe suddenly became a cliff, the way a laugh once shared became an echo inscribed with absence, the particular choreography required to dress when a knee would not cooperate. In the quiet hours of the night, when the castle's hearth breathed its last and the tapestries softened into shadow, she would trace the outline of those losses with her fingertips, as if touch could rearrange what had happened. Disability had taught her to measure distances other people never noticed. The increment between a hand and a rail, the arc her body must describe to settle into a chair. It taught her how often the world judged by locomotion rather than by the breadth of a heart. There was a grief layered beneath the inconvenience, a kind that settled like silt. It was not merely the lacking of legs, but the deletion of an expected future. The simple, private things a village assumes as inheritances, A marriage, a child's name whispered, a summer stroll to the river. People in Ilmer had excised her from those narratives with a clean, practiced hand. They had not simply turned away, they had rewritten what she might become. That deliberate erasure stung worst of all. People left messages in their absence, the way they avoided her at market, the curt hope that stray animals would not be kept, and each omission felt like a verdict. Mara had once believed a spine of will could rebut 1,000 verdicts. She still believed in will, but it had been tempered by so many small destructions that its edges were less hopeful than necessary. Sitting by the new window of Kaelith's chamber, a window that made the forest look like an inked horizon, Mara began to name the wounds aloud, not for confession, but to understand their shape. The castle held a patient silence around her voice, as if it, too, wished to learn the language of her injuries. Speaking was an act of defiance here. In the valley, her speech had been trimmed of consequence. Here, even when she spoke of shame, someone listened with an attention that did not reduce her to pity. Kaelith watched her in those first days with an intensity that made her both wary and oddly unmoored. To be watched by him was to be seen by an animal whose eyes did not waste breath on things that did not matter. He noticed the small economies in her life, the way she folded a blanket, the care with which she turned a page, the particular cadence of her sigh. Where the valley had counted the absence of legs, Kaelith catalogued gestures as if they were proof texts of a humanity he had thought long outgrown. From his vantage, centuries stretched like a narrow road behind him. He had been born into an order that once measured law by tooth and crown, an order called both by reverence and by fear. The Alpha clan, in its argent age, had worn the world like a coat, tailoring fate with a stern hand. They had ruled, yes, but they had also fed on the forms that make subjects useful: blood, fear, and the ritual of dominion. Power had been their lexicon, everything else had been subordinate. Kaelith remembered the ceremonies, the oaths given on nights when the moon was a silver blade. He remembered the cadence of hungry court and the political etiquettes that turned blood into a ledger. And he remembered solitude in a way an immortal should not forget. Command had taught him to be cold where warmth would ruin, to count attachments as liabilities. It had taught him to move like a shadow, long, patient, and unowned. But something had shifted in him that made those teachings feel like shackles. He chose exile long before he met Mara, not from cowardice, but from a kind of exhausted conscience. To rule required consuming. To consume finally hollowed him into a shape he resisted inhabiting. Exile was a protest and a sentence, a refusal to keep accounts with hunger, and a banishment from the only world that had taught him what he was. He had left the old courts, the carved seats of power, and come to the quiet of Ilmer where stone remembered different rights. When he first held Mara, something in him recognized a pattern he had never named. The beauty of a life lived within constraint. Immortality had many gifts, but not the small, mortal inventiveness required to make meaning from absence. Mortals stitched purpose into the spaces left blank by loss. They tasted smaller joys with an urgency immortals often mocked or could not feel. In Mara's economy of small acts, Kaelith saw a stubbornness that rendered his vast experience thin and jealous. She did not bluff its strength. She cultivated it through repetition and necessity. There was a dignity in accepting limits that he had never learned to claim. Their conversations wandered like rivers, starting from easy things and carving deeper channels. They spoke of weather and the stubbornness of mice that gnawed at the pantry, of the way history smelled when old dust was disturbed, of the strange newness of lavender-scented hearths. Slowly, speech moved to memory. Kaelith told her fragments of life not as confession, but as illumination. The names of places he had seen burn and bloom, the rituals he had abandoned, the faces he could no longer forget. Mara, in turn, recited names of those who had left her, not in accusation so much as registry. She traced the map of grief with a cartographer's patience, noting the landmarks where kindness frayed. Loneliness, when named by two creatures of such different clocks, took on a new geometry. Kaelith's loneliness was wide and patient, like deserts that kept their silence. Mara's was acutely domestic, a set of small rooms where things went untended. He had watched empires crumble and nights dissolve into other nights. She had watched a bell stop tolling in a valley that forgot its own rhythms. Where he had unrealistic time, she had the sharpness of scarcity. Where she had brittle hope, he had the worn knowledge that the world asks for payment. It was in a quiet between storms, when rain spattered the high windows and the castle smelled of wet stone, that Kaelith told her something that made the chamber hold its breath. He did not speak as one issuing edicts. He spoke as if setting down a map. "There is an old thing," he said. "A prophecy, if you will, that has been half-remembered and half-wished by those who keep our histories. They say, when the broken one walks, the undying heart will bind. The crown of night will find a morning in her hands." Mara chewed the inside of her lip. Prophecies in folk tales were often ways to dress hope in robes of inevitability or to justify cruelty later. She had been cautious around words that claimed destiny. The valley had consigned her to a role without asking her consent. But the way Kaelith said it, not with triumph, but with a tremor that felt precarious, suggested that the prophecy carried as much dread as promise. "Is that why you took me?" she asked, because suspicions are the honest currency of someone taught to read motives as weather. He looked at the hand she had folded in her lap, at the knuckles whitened with habit. "Not only," he said, "but prophecies can be doors as easily as chains. I have borne many chains. I have feared that if the prophecy were true, it would be used to make you smaller, an instrument in the hands of those who still dream of empire. I left so I would not become what I am told to be." Mara felt the weight of the words settle between them like a stone. The idea that she might be a hinge between an ancient order and some new future unsettled her. She had longed for dignity precisely to avoid being used. Yet the seed of something else, hope or dread, had been sown. The world that had rewritten her story might yet try to read her story as a map for its own ends. Night pressed at the window, and the rain became a soft applause. Kaelith reached out, not in command, but in the awkward attempt of one who has learned to measure touch, and covered her fingers with his. For an immortal who had measured long eras, it was a small, terrible offering. For Mara, it was a tight thread tied between two uneven hands. "What if I don't want to be what prophecy dictates?" she whispered. "Then we will write a different line," he replied, and in that simple vow lay both rebellion and fear. It was the precise, brittle hope both had avoided naming until then. Outside, the forest breathed and its shadows shifted. The castle listened. Somewhere, unaccounted for by prediction or will, a future began to tilt, not fully formed and not wholly safe. The morning after the rain cleared, the castle felt rinsed. Light, thin, and tentative as new linen, slipped between the stones and found the places where dust had settled in quiet opinion. Mara woke to this softer glare, and the unfamiliar sensation of not hearing the valley's small hiss of judgment. Here, the silence felt fuller, not empty. She dressed with hands that had the memory of many small rehearsals. The simple act of tucking a thread back into place felt like an occupation of the body that had been denied her. Kaelith had invited her to the solar, a room warmed by low windows and a table carved with a lattice of sigils. He had prepared tea that smelled of bitter mint and something darker beneath. The servants moved around them with a reverence that kept conversation sparse. They understood intuitively the ceremony of small things in which two people try to repair a life. The worry that had nested in Mara's chest since she first felt his grip on her had not loosened. It lived in the hollow beneath her breastbone like an animal awaiting cue. The knowledge that he fed, that his power relied on the leak of life, that the nights might eventually turn to long calls where only one stayed whole. She had learned the vocabulary of fear, avoidance, bargaining, the small compromises made to stay safe. She had named monsters in the valley, drawn them with careful strokes, and taught herself how to hold her breath when they passed. Now the monster sat opposite her with a bowl in his hands, looking less like legend and more like a man at a tea table, which made her fear sharper and stranger. "You asked for me," she said finally, because the air had to be split and words were the best blade she had. "Why won't you feed on me? If we are what the valley tells stories of, why not take what you need?" Kaelith set his cup down with a measured clack. For a long moment he did not answer, as if he were considering how best to take the thread of the question and not unravel the cloth they stood upon. His face, when he finally spoke, was folded in a map of restraint, lines like the remembered rivers of a country he had once loved and then left. "Because hunger is not the only thing that has shaped me," he said. His voice had the low grain of someone who had learned to ration confessions. "Because to feed is to bind. Every taking leaves an architecture of obligation in its wake. I have been both builder and prisoner of those obligations." Mara traced her thumb across the rim of the cup, feeling the ridged glaze. "You could be whole," she said. "If you fed, if you took, you would not," she faltered, ashamed of the thought that sprang to life. Not whole in the way the valley used the word, but whole in the simple arithmetic of appetite and satiation. To ask him to be less hungry felt obscene, like asking a storm not to rain. Kaelith's gaze fell to his hands, to the pale knuckles that closed and opened around the porcelain. "I have been whole in centuries," he replied slowly. "I have watched kingdoms enroll themselves under my shadow, lovers offer their throats with promises, priests sanctify the taking. Whole is a currency I know how to mint, but I will not become an authority who uses want as justification. I stand here in exile because power taught me to become something I could not forgive." He leaned forward, and for a breath the room contracted. Hearth smoke, tea steam, the memory of rain. "I hunger," he admitted. "You must understand the honesty of that. Hunger is not shameless, it is always a ledger of debts. I have taken. I have also been cruel in the name of need. I have watched the light in eyes dim when I fed. I prefer not to have that on my hands again." Mara listened and found her own fear rearranging itself into something like understanding. The monster in the stories was always flat and easy, a hole to be feared, a night to be escaped. The man before her carried history. The confession of hunger, when offered without glamour, did not make him monstrous. It made him human in the way that confessing misery makes one human. It did not soothe the fact that he could still hurt her. It merely made the threat intelligible. "What if I offer?" Mara asked, the question coming out thinner than she meant. The notion had been whispering at the edges of her mind, a sacrificial thought, both foolish and noble, the old human currency of helping the one who protects you. She saw in the action the possibility of repayment, to make herself useful in the only way that seemed immediate and valuable. Kaelith's head turned, and in that glance she read 100 climates. Desire, calculation, the practiced calm of one who had learned to keep his hands from easy ends. "Do you know what offering oneself to a thing like me entails?" he asked. "There are rituals, there are changes. Blood is not merely red in its physics, it is narrative in some orders. The taking of blood makes a kinship that is not always consent and not always graceful. It carves obligations on both who gives and who receives. But if you refuse always," she said, voice thin with the strain of wanting to be both brave and alive, "then either," she stopped. It was a coward's logic. Feed to end the fear, or refuse and let fear gnaw endlessly. The valley had taught her to barter herself for peace. She could not help the reflex. Kaelith closed his eyes as if in prayer. The hush in the room crested into an attentive quiet. When he spoke again, his words were soft as cloth. "There is a different promise I can give," he said. "I will not take from you because I cannot bear to be the instrument of your erasure. I refuse to make your life a currency for my continuance. I will live with hunger. That is the oath I make you now." The statement landed somewhere between sacrament and daring. It was not merely restraint. It was renunciation. A self-inflicted exile from the easiest of comforts. The choice was dangerous because it asked him to be less than what he might be, to practice lack as virtue. It was also a radical act of respect, honoring the fact that she was not there to be consumed. "Why?" Mara asked, the single syllable of the question holding both accusation and longing. "Why choose that for yourself?" Kaelith's lashes cast bars across his cheek. "Because I have seen what I become when I do not choose," he said. "Because I have watched futures fold like paper under my hands. Because someone once asked me to be a different thing, and I could not." He swallowed, and the movement made his throat look like an exposed hinge. "Because it is the only way I can stand to look at myself in the morning." Mara considered that. She had been taught to believe that saving oneself was always a lesser task than saving others. To choose restraint to avoid becoming a monster felt like a kind of self-preservation that required courage. In a valley where choice was thin, His choosing for himself felt almost scandalous. She placed her hand over his, an awkward, hesitant contact that carried the warmth of a living thing pressing against the cold scaffold of legend. "Then I promise," she said, the word both vow and negotiation. "I will not be afraid of you. I will not let the valley teach me to shrink anymore. I am not charity. I will not be a ledger. I will be myself." Kaelith's fingers curled, not possessive but in the slow confirmation of contact. "You do not have to bear my history," he answered. "Nor do I ask you to carry my choices. We are two beings who will make mistakes and learn their shapes. I will keep my hands from taking what you are not willing to give. That is my oath." It was not a blood oath in the literal sense, no carved sigils, no shared draft. It was instead a pact of restraint, of presence, a vow to hold back an appetite as much as to hold her in times of danger. The promise felt ancient because it required the forsaking of old habits, a rare thing both to mortals and immortals. In that quiet, Mara let a small relief unspool inside her chest. She would not be eaten. She would not be used. For a while they sat with their hands joined across the table, two different clocks speaking in a small present. The castle hummed with an old patience, as if it, too, approved of oaths that reshaped chains into something softer. Outside, the forest shifted and settled. Inside, Mara tasted a future that included an unchewed life, not untroubled, certainly, but chosen. She had offered the most dangerous thing she possessed, trust. And Kaelith, who had spent lifetimes learning how to take, had learned for once how to refuse. The castle settled into a rhythm the way a heart gets used to a new pulse, irregular at first, then steadied by repetition. Days blurred into a soft inventory of small courtesies. Kaelith's quiet pacing through the halls, Mara's slow hours by the window, the servants moving like careful punctuation. The forest beyond the high windows changed with the weather, and Mara learned to read its moods. The tilt of branches that meant wind, the hush that came before snowfall, the furtive dart of a fox that suggested the rawness of hunger. Her own body set to its new timetable, too. Stretches at dawn, the measured swing of limbs to keep joints from stiffening, the tiny flights of courage she practiced in secret. Then the whispering began. It was not the open announcer of a messenger riding in with a sealed crest. It arrived instead by rustle and glance, and the way the servants folded their hands to hide worry. News in the castle moved like embroidery, small stitches of fact woven into rumor until the whole tapestry vibrated with meaning. At first, Mara thought it was the valley's gossip taking on a new medium. A name or two carried along the roots of the trees, a fragment of an old court song hummed by a footman. But the scent under the words was different, old authority, like the iron tang of a coin minted to buy obedience. Kaelith first noticed it in the court beyond the hearth. A messenger from the outer lands arrived with a face like ash and eyes dragged by fatigue. He bowed but did not linger. The man's words were sharp. There were movements in the north, he said. Houses where the old courts had their fingers were starting to stir again. Names were spoken with a kind of reverence that made Mara's tongue clench. Those who still believed the Alphas should rule had not forgiven Kaelith's exile. They called him a traitor for turning his back on the law of taking. "They will use you," the messenger said softly, as he poured wine into goblets that trembled in his hand. "In times like these, they reach for any lever. The broken are loud in the mouths of the old order." He did not look at Mara when he spoke the last words. His eyes skirted like flies avoiding an open wound. Kaelith's jaw tightened, a movement Mara had seen only when memory dragged something painful to the surface. He listened, then folded the news away like a page turned in a book that could not be burned. He did not say much, but the weight of his silence was not for lack of thought. Mara watched him and felt a new, disconcerting tide rise, the knowledge that her presence had ripples beyond their sheltered rooms. That night the castle's shadows lengthened with a tension that set servants whispering behind closed doors. Kaelith called Mara to the gallery, where tapestries of hunting scenes watched them like old witnesses. He stood in the long room, palms folded, a figure carved out of decision. "There are those who would see you as a bargaining chip," he said without preamble. His voice held the iron quality of one who had made hard choices before. "They will argue that by taking you we can extract from me what they could not by force. My allegiance, my voice, perhaps even my seat. They will use your body as argument." Mara's throat tightened. The words painted the valley's worst imaginings into a clear shape. To be used, not merely loathed or pitied, but turned into leverage, was an indignity so precise it felt surgical. "Then hide me," she said, because hiding was what the valley expected from those who were inconvenient. The plea sounded like surrender until she saw the expression on Kaelith's face. He shook his head, slow as a turning tide. "To hide you is to declare you less than you are. To tuck you away behind curtains is to ratify the valley's verdict." There was a fierceness there, not the predatory hunger of a vampire, but the moral stubbornness of someone who had chosen exile to avoid precisely this calculus. "I will not keep you as an object to be bartered, but I will fortify the castle. I will call favors. I will stand between the old order and you." Mara looked at him and found the familiar ache of being offered protection that felt like possession. She had tasted that in villagers who smiled while closing their shutters. Here, the offer was different. It arrived wrapped in a refusal to diminish her. Still, the memory of being carried to the wood like refuse surfaced like a bitter stone in her throat. "I will not be hidden," she said, and the statement was quieter than she felt. "I will not be used as a shield for someone's ambition. If they want to make me a thing, they will have to come for me straight." The words startled Kaelith. They were fragile, not in their intent, but in the audacity of her claiming agency where none had been expected. He cared for her, yes, in a way that was both protective and selfish, because she had come to mean something to him he had not anticipated. But he had to balance that care against an older calculus. Those who loved had to know how to let go when holding would kill. If her refusal invited danger, it would test both their vows. He approached her, the distance closing like the closing of a book. Mara felt the warmth of his presence and reached out before thought could meddle. Her hand found the plane of his cheek, fingers tracing the fine scars mapped there like a constellation. The skin beneath was not the papery thing of legend. It was warm and real, a living topography of choices he'd made long ago. She had imagined him as a thing of night, but the scars told another story. Of duels, of nights where regret had been carved into flesh as punishment for command. "You are more human than any I've known," she said, the words falling into the gallery like a small violation of the rules she had kept all her life. It was not an insult. It was recognition, the most dangerous and intimate of things. To call him human was to collapse the careful definitions the valley had assigned him. Kaelith's eyes flickered at the touch. The look that passed over him was complex. Surprise, something like gratitude, and a guarded pleasure as if she had given him a forbidden comfort. He lowered his forehead, placing it briefly against her palm in a gesture that had no grand meaning, but felt seismic to Mara. "And you," he replied quietly, "are more than I believed possible." They stood like that for a beat that stretched and then folded. The gallery felt suddenly narrow, the tapestries watching like old gossip. To be close enough to read the breath at each other's lips was to know how quickly everything might tilt. The next days became a study in both preparation and normalcy. Kaelith strengthened defenses in ways Mara had not expected, not only by summoning sentries, but by walking the battlements himself at dawn, learning the sound of approaching horses and the logic of patrols. Mara joined him when she could, wrapped in the stormwater wool he had given her. She sat on the parapet and listened to him speak of strategies as if the two tasks, teaching and guarding, were inevitably bound. He taught her to hear the difference between hoofbeats and the scrape of a wagon wheel, to notice the language of the horizon. Their intimacy grew like a plant in a hidden court, slow, insistent, and resistant to the weather. Mara learned the catalog of his silences and the small irritations that made his hand clench. He learned the way she laughed when something surprised her, a sound that had nothing to do with the valley's pity and everything to do with her reclaiming joy. Once, in the hush after a lesson, Mara laid her head against his chest and felt the irregular beat beneath his vest, most assuredly not the warmth of a mortal's heart, but an echo of time. She traced the edges of a scar with a thumb, and he did not draw away. "You make promises you keep," she murmured. "And you," he answered, voice low as a covenant, "refuse to be small." Outside, the forest shifted, waiting. Within the castle, strategies were drawn and contingencies considered. The shadow in the north that whispered of the old order gathered its own breath. For all the preparation, for all the vows and touch and small lessons, one truth hovered. When those who prize dominion return, the cost of defiance will be tall. But there was, now, another truth too. In the place between them, something human and less than human had begun to knot, and neither could pretend it would not tug when the hunt finally came. The night the old order came back to the valley, the sky tore itself open. Rain fell in sheets that sounded like metal being hammered on the castle's leaded roof. Wind came with a voice that demanded to be obeyed, tearing at battlements and carrying with it the scent of iron and old promises. The forest outside the high walls bowed under the weather, and in doing so, seemed to make room for something older than weather, a procession that moved like a tide, urgent and relentless. They came by night and by law. Lanterns bobbed among the trees, not the pale household lights of Ilmer, but the deliberate torches of a hunting party. The riders were arrayed in cloaks the color of funeral smoke. Their faces were covered, but not because they wished anonymity, rather to indicate an order where names were less important than rank. Banners snapped in the wind, bearing sigils that had been burned into the memory of the clan for generations. These were not common brigands. They were emissaries of a court that had never forgiven Kaelith for his exile. Inside the castle, preparation was a choreography of tight movements. Kaelith had not slept. He moved like a man whose nights were a ledger of possible losses, checking gates, barking instructions, and setting wards that hummed faintly in the stone. The servants had been dispersed to safe rooms. Mara, against his wishes, was taken to the gallery where she could see the horizon for miles, and, if need be, meet whatever came with a face that refused to be a bargaining chip. "You should not stand where they may see you," Kaelith urged, his hand cold where it brushed the back of her wool. "If they take you before I can, if they take me, they will take me for what I am," Mara interrupted. Her voice was steadier than either of them liked. "Not as a thing you hide behind, not as currency." He studied her in the shard light that leaked through the high windows. For once his patience frayed like a rope near the end of its useful life. "Your courage does not absolve them of the cruelty they mean to practice," he said. The sentence was both warning and plea. The first assault blurred into its own myth. Torches flared along the outer wall and then like a fever took and spread, a snarling array of shadows. Men and women who had the old courts blessing brought ladders that hissed against stone, grappling hooks whose teeth found hold in mortar, and ropes to scale the flanks. There was a sound like 1,000 nails being driven into night. Kaelith met them with steel and with creatures older than either, wolves summoned from the borders of his lands, wraiths of mist that curled to his command, the low, bordering chant of a thing that called itself authority. He fought not for glory, but with the grim choreography of one who knew what it meant to lose. His motions were a language of precision. Step, parry, let the enemy tire and miscalculate. He moved like a shadow made sharp, and where he passed men fell as if cut from a cloth too thin. The attackers pressed, relentless as tide. Mara watched from the gallery, palms latched to the cold stone until her nails whitened, feeling the thunder of hoof and clatter as if it were an earthquake in her chest. The firelight from the hall below threw their faces into grotesque angles. Men and women who believed in old math. Strength divided into dominion, life reduced to utility. She wanted to scream, to leap, to do anything to unmake the calculus that treated her like commodity. The battle found its center at the main gate. Kaelith stood like a pillar of night against the open sky, a figure enormous and alone. He moved through men with a predatory grace that was terrifying to behold, and then, on a sudden break in the rhythm as a flying blade found a seam, he staggered. Mara saw the flash of crimson where his shoulder met a blade and the way his breath hitched, a human thing, sudden and disarming. He should have been unkillable. He was not. The wound of iron was precise and old, and put a new gear into motion inside the creature known as Kaelith. He fell, not to death then, but to the brittle edge of it, losing balance, staggering on the slick stones, blood pooling like an accusation. Panic, raw and immediate, unclenched Mara's practiced composure. The gallery suddenly felt too small for the surge of motion she felt in her limbs. The boards beneath her were no barrier to the world. She tried to leap from the parapet, the cold air ripping at the wool around her, but strength left to other parts of the body did not translate into the mobility she wanted. She slammed her heels against the parapet, clawed and failed, the world slipping away in a stomachache of impotence. Then something older than technique nudged her. A verse from memory, something the valley's grandmothers used to murmur at storms. Words half charm, half sarcastic comfort. The prophecy, the thing Kaelith had spoken of with tremor and dread, unfolded in her head like a map. "When the broken one walks," she mouthed to herself, each syllable an attempt to summon the door it promised. There were other lines, bones of old ritual, and for reasons she could not fully name, she began to recite them aloud. Threads of sound can be small magics if the listener perceives them as such. Myra's voice, small in the hurly-burly of battle, threaded through the noise. It was not a spell of immediate engineering, not a swipe of wand energy. It was a human thing petition, offered not to claim the power of gods, but to ask favor of an older order of kinship. She recited the prophecy's lines not to command, but to call. The effect was not immediate and theatrical. It was more like a change in the grain of the night. The soldiers faltered, as if a cold memory had brushed their minds. Torches guttered as though the air had thickened. A subtle hush, like a held breath, fell over the battlements. For a breath, the rhythm of the fight mutated. Kaelith, who had been at the edge of the abyss, found that he could move again. He rose not with the mauling howl of a monster, but with a focused, anchored motion. His features sharpened. His eyes became concentrated pistons of purpose. Yet the victory was partial. The enemy had not been wholly turned. Shards of violence still reigned. One of the assailants, a blade like a question, found a new path to Kaelith, slipping past a line of wolves whose attention had been distracted by the human equation. Kaelith took the hit for Mara's name, not because he had to, but because the shape of his love for her had made such sacrifice inevitable. He reeled and slid from the gate, collapsing where stones answered his weight with cold silence. He was dimmed in ways that made the servants recoil. Blood pooled under him like a betrayed pledge. The castle's wards sputtered, their hum weakened by the power drawn to defend the fallen Alpha. Mara had been taught that blood had the currency of story. She had promised she would not be a ledger. But here was an accounting to be made, a life tethered to others, a choice of whether to claim that tether even at cost. She climbed down, not with the neatness of a practiced hand, but with a graceless, determined scramble. Hands that had been used to small tasks now found grips on ropes and banisters. Servants and soldiers who would once have hid her in a room now found courage to help, their eyes ringed with new respect. Mara reached Kaelith and found his breathing shallow and his eyes dimming at the edges. "Hold," she whispered, because words held in battle like stitches might. "Hold!" His fingers grazed hers, a small, freighted contact. "Do not," he began, but the fragment dissolved into a hush as he struggled to breathe. She had some sticks in her pack from the herbalist, bandage linen, a sharpened pin from a sewing kit, a small vial of iron tonic. None of it should have been sufficient to save an immortal bound by claws and old law. But she had also a different thing, the absolute willingness to give what she could. It was a kind of sacrament she had never been taught to perform other than in her own small affairs. Mara pricked her palm with the pin, sharp and careful. Pain flared, bright and immediate, a starburst that made her breath flinch. Blood welled not much, but the color was perfect and warm and wholly hers. She let it bead and then, with hands that trembled but did not falter, pressed her palm to Kaelith's lips. The action was a theft of conventions and a surrender of oath. She gave him her blood to ingest. The rules of their earlier vows reconfigured in the instant of necessity. Kaelith, who had sworn not to take from her, looked at the offering and saw choice in a raw, distilled form. He did not take by force. He drank because she offered. Consent was the knife that cut ritual into something else. The taste would be iron and earth and the memory of all the small days she had lived. It warmed him like hearth after winter. His breath changed as she pressed the blood to him, life and need meeting in a compliance that burned both ways. He did not simply absorb it. Something in the magic of their ages, prophecy, choice, and human sacrifice, stitched through the wound. Color returned slowly to his skin. His eyes brightened first with the heat of pain, then with a burgeoning steadiness that felt like being found again. Around them, the battle wavered as the attackers sensed the shift. The impressive spectacle of their intended conquest had been interrupted by something they did not master. The banners faltered. The lines retreated a step, as if youth met with a fiercer, stranger thing. Kaelith rose, not whole but mended enough, bearing the smear of Mara's blood as a new seal on an old map. He took her hand then, and held it like someone who had been blind and found sight. The gesture was not regal but profoundly intimate. "You should not have," he whispered, voice raw. "You saved me first," she said, because there was truth in the ledger of debts when love wrote them. "I offer it willingly." He bowed his head, then pressed his forehead against hers, an odd priestly contact. "You bind me," he murmured, a promise made on the knuckles of the living. "And I will be bound." The storm eased slowly, as if satisfied with its theatrics. Outside, the forest exhaled and the attackers retreated, carried back into their own dark calculations. Inside, by the light of flickering torches, Mara and Kaelith sat amid the rubbles of a near ruin and found in their joined hands a new covenant. Not the old law written in blood without consent, but a pact of mutual risk and human offering. The prophecy's lines had been read and lived in a way neither had expected, not as a mandate but as a bridge. Neither of them was untouched. He bore fresh wounds and a new indebtedness. She bore the memory of giving a piece of herself in the most immediate way imaginable. Outside the castle, dawn bled the world into a gray wash that was neither victory nor defeat, but the honest page between the two. They had been tested, not by the absence of hunger, but by the presence of choice. The old order had not been banished. It would come again, teeth bared and laws sharpened. But for the moment, they had rewritten one ledger. Two beings, one choice, a saving that was neither ownership nor consumption, but the radical exchange of life with consent. When the last torch guttered, and the banners on the far ridge lay folded into sodden cloth, the castle settled into an exhausted silence that felt like the aftertaste of a meal no one wanted to digest alone. The defenders moved like people waking from a fever dream, checking wounds, righting chairs, offering one another handholds that were less ritual than necessity. Outside, the forest kept its counsel. The northern riders had been driven off in ragged retreat, swallowed back into the lanes and politics that bred them. The old order had not been destroyed. Such things rarely are, but it had been repulsed, its momentum checked by two stubborn, unlikely things. A creature who had learned restraint and a woman who would not hide. Cost, as always, was measured in particulars. The castle's parapets bore new chips where ladders had bitten into stone. A sentinel's son lay in the infirmary with a shattered arm, swearing at the pain and laughing whenever someone looked at him, as if laughter could stitch bone. Wolves padded about the courtyard with the easy arrogance of beasts that had been called and had obeyed. They nosed at the bloodstains with the indifference of creatures to whose powers the politics of feeling were foreign. Kaelith moved through the aftermath with a gait that no longer tried to pretend it was untouched. The wound he had taken at the main gate had scarred inwardly, knotting something in him that made his breath shorter and his patience both keener and more brittle. For Mara, the days after the storm were a study in small recoveries. The healing warmth the castle offered, bandages changed by steady hands, tea steeped with herbs that sang of medicine, a mantle where mornings could be tidied, gave her space to name the things that had shifted inside. People looked at her differently now, not merely with what had been there before, pity or disgust, but with a new thread running through their gazes, a recognition that she had not been vanquished and that, in surviving, she had reframed some expectation. One evening, when the rain had softened to a suggestion and the hearth in Kaelith's chamber burned low, he asked her to come close. The castle hummed with quieter chores. Servants moved like ghosts that had been permissioned to re-enter human life. In the hush, the two of them sat facing one another, their hands an island of warmth between chill stone and ancient tapestries. "You gave me life," Kaelith said at last, voice rough with sleep and scar, and a gratitude he had not learned to translate into words. "You offered something I vowed I would not take, And in that offering you gave me a choice as pure as any oath. It bound me in ways I am only beginning to understand." Mara's fingers found his, the touch like a shore finding its tide. "You did not refuse when you had reason," she said. "You refused because you chose something else. You refused hunger as habit." Her gaze softened on him. She had watched him in the days since the attack, seen him awake at odd hours with his hands pressed to a fresher bruise, seen him trace the maps of combat and count what could and could not be saved. "I thought once that saving someone meant losing yourself. I'm frightened of that still." He turned his palm up and let her watch the lines he carried. "I am frightened," he admitted, "of what I was trained to be, of what my nature can still teach me to do if I'm careless. I have taken from those I loved and from those I vowed to protect, because power taught me that taking was efficient. I fear corrupting you, that my appetite, even restrained, would inscribe obligation on you where none should be. I fear making of you a sacrament to my survival rather than a companion." She considered him, the flicker of torchlight catching the hollows beneath his eyes, the fine scar along his jaw. He wore his age oddly, not as wrinkles but as the architecture of decisions. "Then let the thing we make be different," she said slowly. "Not blood as purchase, but blood as pledge if blood must be shared." She hesitated, then reached for the small linen where she kept the pin that had saved him in the storm. An object of domestic magic turned talisman. "If it will bind you, then bind me, but bind me because I ask you to, not because you take." The words were an invitation and a test, the kind of thing both of them had been taught to avoid. Kaelith's throat worked. He looked as if centuries might tumble from the shelves of his mind and land messy at his feet. Then he rose and did a thing that felt more ancient than knighthood or coronation. He made an offering of his own body. He asked permission with the slow formality of someone who had once taken without asking. Mara, steady of heart from nights of terror and days of stubborn practice, knelt before him with a bowl of warmed wine and the small linens and time. She did not present herself as sacrifice, but as equal, a person choosing a path where sacrifice might be mutual. When Kaelith bowed his head and opened his mouth to drink, he did not do so as predator. He drank with a care that made the act almost holy. He tasted her blood with the gravity of one encountering a book of scripture, putting the letters to his lips and reading their import. He did not greedily lap. He sipped, reverent. Each sip was a stitch, sewing two lives together with thread that carried both mortal frailty and immortal continuity. As the exchange completed, something subtle and profound shifted. There was an ache at the base of Kaelith's throat that eased as if irons had been loosened. For Mara, the act was not erasure but affirmation. She felt the give and take of lives aligning like gears. The bond formed was not the binding of the old courts, not an ownership masked as union, but a covenant based on consent, reciprocity, and the knowledge of cost. They spoke into the night of fears and terms long avoided. Mara admitted her dread of becoming a shadow to his long life, of watching children she might have borne with her while he did not. Kaelith confessed he feared the slow corrosion of affection into entitlement, of gentleness calcifying into expectation. They named boundaries. How often he might seek what she offered, what other forms of sustenance he would turn to, and how they would navigate the inevitable moments when hunger would press like winter upon the soul. In naming, they discovered not merely the contours of compromise but the architecture of fidelity. Love here was less ablaze than a disciplined tending. It required feeding other things besides appetite, attention, laughters, silences, stories shared late in the night. It required the development of rituals smaller and kinder than court's commands. Kaelith vowed to teach Mara how to read the older signs, not to make her a relic, but to arm her with knowledge she might use. Mara vowed to hold him to his word and to claim her own life in full measure. To take walks on the parapet when weather permitted, to read aloud from books that had nothing to do with war, to laugh and to be visible. By the time the candles had burned to nubs and the moon had climbed to a place where it could be considered a witness, they sat closer than when the night began. The scarred map of Kaelith's skin and the quiet traces of Mara's life braided into something like a promise. It was not the tidy union sung about in the valley's stories, nor was it immunity from pain. It was instead a shared reckoning. Each would carry scars and the memory of cost, and each would allow the other the grace to be flawed. Outside, the northern wind sent a soft accent through the trees as if reading approval. Within the castle, two beings, one bound to the hourglass of mortality, one to the long sweep of feces of centuries, found a place where their lives could touch without one extinguishing the other. The old order's threats lay like a bruise beyond the windows, but inside, in a chamber lit by the minimal holiness of two people choosing one another, Mara and Kaelith had made a vow that felt, strangely and utterly, like dawn. The Valley of Ilmer had always been a place of endings. Generations whispered of its shadows, of wolves whose eyes gleamed brighter than lanterns, of castles that swallowed wanderers whole. To the people who lived huddled in its villages, dawn was not a promise but a reprieve, a fragile shield against the inevitable return of night. But dawn had changed. From the highest tower of the fortress that once inspired dread, Mara Everell walked the corridor with her chin lifted. No longer did her body drag itself across the stones in desperation. She walked, aided but upright, each step a quiet rebellion against the verdict life had given her. The servants who once averted their eyes now dipped their heads as she passed, not because she was feared, because she was seen. Her hand brushed the wall as she went, fingertips trailing the carvings of centuries. These halls were no longer prisons of echo and dust. They pulsed with warmth, with voices, with the memory of a battle survived and a covenant forged. She had shed the name they once spat at her, crippled daughter, burden, thing to be left to wolves. Now the castle knew her as its lady. The valley, if rumor carried true, had begun to murmur her as something stranger, the flame that tamed the alpha's hunger. And Kaelith, the alpha vampire, the one even his kind had called cursed, was no longer hollow. She found him at the eastern balcony, as she often did, where the stone opened out into sky and the horizon bled its first strokes of color. He stood tall, wrapped in a cloak that caught the wind, his profile cut against the paling dark like some statue of grief remade into defiance. His scars, once hidden, he bore openly now. They were not marks of shame, but of endurance. And though his eyes still glimmered with that inhuman depth, the gold-veined black of a predator born from night, there was something else there when he turned toward her. Purpose. He extended his hand without a word. She placed hers in it, the gesture simple but heavier than crowns. Fingers entwined, flesh and immortal sinew, they faced the dawn together. For Kaelith, the sun had always been a warning, a blaze that reminded him of what he could not touch, of the warmth forever denied. But with Mara at his side, dawn no longer mocked him. The light rising over Ilmer did not scourge him, it revealed him. He was not a shadow cast against her brightness, he was part of it. "You've changed this place," Mara whispered, her voice steady but carrying awe. "The valley no longer trembles at your name." "No," Kaelith murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon. "We changed it." His thumb brushed the back of her hand. "I was stone and silence. You were flame and refusal. Alone, we would have withered. Together," he gestured toward the valley. The villages below, once shuttered, were stirring, thin tendrils of smoke rising from chimneys. Even the river, the same one Mara had once called a ribbon of ash, caught the dawn in silver light. "Together, we are something the old orders cannot unmake." Mara's chest tightened, not with the ache of weakness, but with a swelling she once thought forbidden. Pride. She had been cast away, broken and unwanted, but she had found a place where her fragility was not a sentence. With Kaelith, her scars were not marks of diminishment, but keys, opening doors, rewriting prophecies, remaking a world. The words of that prophecy, whispered in the dark by rival clans, still lingered. The broken one who binds the undying heart. Once she had recoiled from it. Now she saw its truth, not brokenness as failure but as passage. Through her fractured body and wounded spirit, she had learned to endure, to listen, to refuse despair. It was not her wholeness that saved Kaelith. It was her imperfection, offered without disguise. A hush fell as the first sunbeam crested the ridge, spilling molten light across the stone. Instinctively, Mara held her breath, fearing it would strike Kaelith down. But the vampire only closed his eyes and tilted his face toward it. The rays touched his skin without burning, softened by whatever strange alchemy her blood and his restraint had wrought. He looked neither monster nor man, but something in between, something new. And Mara, with her hand in his, felt no fear, only certainty. "We are no longer what they called us," she said, her words cutting through the dawn like a vow. "Not crippled, not cursed, not abandoned, not hollow." Kaelith opened his eyes, the faintest smile curving his scarred mouth. "No, we are a beginning." They stood together, the wind carrying their cloaks, the valley stretching endless before them. Behind them lay centuries of exile and cruelty. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also freedom. Whatever shadows would come, and they would come, they would not be faced alone. Mara tightened her grip on his hand. "Then let this be our dawn." And so it was. The first light broke fully over Ilmer, gilding stone, river, and forest in brilliance. In that blaze stood a human who had once crawled through the dirt, and an alpha vampire who had once hidden from the sun, not prey and predator, not master and thrall, but equals. Together, they had rewritten fate.